start with the obvious announcements. I think most of you got my email this morning. We have had 6 students in this class test positive for COVID this week. They have come to this class, they've sat here. Be aware, right? You may or may not have been exposed, but if you have been exposed, you may not know it. And so to keep your fellows from being exposed, you need to be wearing a mask, okay? So, that's, and then I got 2 emails after I sent it saying, oh yeah, me too. So, I guess that's 8. Actually, I didn't check. They could have been in the other class. The other class had 4. And so, but still, it's pretty high numbers. This is much higher than any problems we had last year. My first week was already higher than it was last year. Hospitalizations are higher than they were last year at this time. I'm going to, one more time, encourage you, if you have not gotten a vaccination, get a vaccination, all right? You can go to Goddard, you can go to CVS, go to your doctor, you can go to the Cleveland County Health Department, all right? It's been approved by the FDA. They've been working on this technology for 50 years. It's safe. It does not have tracking chips in it. So I'm just saying, protect yourself, protect others. And you know, and I want to say, I come to this from a pretty personal perspective in that I have 4 children who are 6 and under. One of them had massive surgery last year so he has a scar from his sternum to his penis. He's immunocompromised, and if I bring something home that's mild, he gets it and goes to the hospital and struggles for his life. All right? So I come to this from a pretty personal perspective. I also have a mom she's vaccinated, but you know, she's also 74 years old. And right now she's going to take care of my kids while I sneak off to Mexico this weekend. So it's important that she also be safe, right? Also, I want to sneak off to Mexico, get vaccinated, so that, you know, it's safer for everybody to travel. Don't you like traveling? Don't you like going places? Don't you like eating out and going to like theaters and stuff? I'm just saying. All right, so quick reminders. This is your class. I'm just going to pop up here in a second whenever I get home 6 more times. This is your class. Just a reminder, the syllabus has all this information in it, right? Not about vaccines, but about the class. These are your modules. This is how you go to Cengage. I have a few people that either entered the class late or were having some problems getting into Cengage. And so they may need that opened. I promise I'm not ignoring you. I just have not had time to do that. I'll do that this afternoon. This is week 1. That's what we talked about, right? You had some readings, the Declaration of Independence, letter from Birmingham Jail. You had workbook chapter 1 due in your lab. And this is the lecture from Wednesday. There's also, if you'll note on the homepage, a link to the YouTube site where Eric has been uploading these web videos, which is amazing that he's doing this for you. Understand, he is taking his comprehensive doctoral exams in a month, and the fact that he's spending this time to, you know, make sure that this gets up here is a gift to you, right? And so it's there. So sorry, I scrolled down too far. Week 2, that's this week. Chapter 2 workbook and chapter 3 workbook are both due. You guys know by now, if you've looked at the workbook, that for the most part, there are some weeks where I ask you to do a little work, right? And I'll remind you about that. But for the most part, I'm asking you what you think, right? I'm asking you what you think. So chapter 2 and 3 workbook are due this week. And then the lecture that I've already given is there, along with the questions that help you focus. These are the questions I will ask on the exam. Okay? And then Today's lecture and questions are there as well. As a reminder, on Friday, in addition to doing your workbook, I'm crazily asking you to write a sentence, right? Go to the assignments where it says, Killers of the Flower Moon or Invisible Man Project. Click on that, not the thesis. Click on the assignment itself. Look at the questions I'm asking, and then go back to the thesis and write a sentence about what you think you're going to write about. Literally a sentence, right? We just want to make sure you're thinking about it. Does that make sense? And you get extra points for it, so why wouldn't you do that? Get a chance to get feedback. Think about it. Midnight on Friday. All right, so let's begin. So this is our class, and I told you guys I'm going to put our ends up there. Ends are again what? Number of people who responded to the poll, right? 214 out of 250. Is that a pretty representative poll for this class? Yeah, it really is. And it looks like you guys are much more Federalist than Anti-Federalist. 77% of you, right? And so the other 22, 23, it rounds. The percentages round. You guys know how math works, mostly, right? At least this part. This would completely take my 6-year-old off kilter. But you guys can handle the fact that it only adds up to 99%. All right. So, more Anti-Federalists and Federalists 15, and the Anti-Federalists 7%. This is typical that classes tend to be more Federalist than Anti-Federalist. That said, you guys are a little bit more Federalist than most classes. It's more like 2/3 usually rather than 3/4. So, that's interesting. That's something for you to know about yourselves, which you didn't even know you knew, right? Or you can't. You maybe still don't care, but that's where you are, all right? I want to remind you guys of democratic challenges. We talked about this last week, so I'm doing a little bit of a recap here. Protecting individual rights and majority rule are essential to a democratic republic. And that's hard to do. Today, I am asking you, the university is actually mandating that you wear masks because of exposure, right? Some of you may say, that's against my individual liberties. But we also know that in order for the majority to continue to go to school, that this is necessary. Individual rights include speech, assembly, publishing, criticizing government, all those things. There is no discussion of facial coverings in the Constitution. Benjamin Franklin, frankly, would have really rather that nudity was not outlawed. He was a big fan of nudity. He often believed in, he called it air bathing, right? Walking around nude. Founding father, kind of a famous guy, right? Nonetheless, he did not consider it to be an individual liberty that there were laws that required him to wear clothes. Right? Majority rule means the group with the most vote wins. And that matters. The group with the most vote wins power over governing decisions. That doesn't necessarily mean that the minority has no rights. As a matter of fact, it means they can't because of the rule of law. We have to be careful of that. We have this rule of law, we have the Constitution that's above that, and then we have the fact that on governing decisions, on policy, right, the majority wins. Majorities can trample individual rights, and well-organized minorities may subvert majority will. We'll talk about money and politics later. We'll talk about the fact that Congress, for the last, almost 30 years, has not represented the will of the people, but has rather represented the will of the wealthy. And before that, it was pretty close to what the people wanted, which is interesting. What happened? Liberties without laws are going to descend into anarchy. So we must have the rule of law. I'll try my clicker here. It says no. As a reminder about the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. Governments are required through social contract to provide life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, justice. And injustice means people have a duty to revolt. Right? Some key takeaways from the Declaration of Independence. Letter from Birmingham Jail. I am here because injustice is here. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Again, we would call Martin Luther King Jr. a new founder. George W. Bush draws upon this as justification for going to war in Iraq. Freedom is never given freely by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. And justice too long delayed is justice denied. And remember, that is part of the Constitution. Well, you don't know. You don't remember yet. But we'll get there. The idea that you have the right to a speedy trial. Right? Justice too long delayed is justice denied. And he also talks about the difference between just and unjust laws, and how an unjust law tramples the rights of the minority and is aimed toward the minority. The Constitution is more elitist than the Declaration of Independence. They wanted the best to govern. The Senate, the President, and the judiciary are all by indirect election or appointment. That's important. There is only one branch of government, one part of one branch of government at this time that is elected directly by the people, and that is the House of Representatives. I know you guys kind of like House of Representatives. Say it. You can say it. Try your voice. Ready?
House of Representatives.
See? Look at that. You can do it. All right? Excellent. House of Representatives. And so when you talk about, hey, look, I want my voice heard, then who's the person that's supposed to be listening to you? Your member of Congress at the House of Representatives, right? Who's your member of Congress? Who can tell me? Can anybody tell me their member of Congress? Representative. That's actually at Oklahoma. Yeah, so Forrest Bennett represents your district at the Oklahoma legislature. I like Forrest. Maybe I'll bring him in here and have him say big things. He's a big man. He says big things. And sometimes I go, oh, Forrest. All right.
Stephanie Bice.
What?
Stephanie Bice.
Stephanie Bice is your U.S. representative, right? At the House of Representatives. Who else? What? Yes. Huh? Troy Nels? Okay. And where are you from? Houston. Okay. All right.
John Rainey.
Sean Rainey? John Rainey. Where are you from? Oh, yes. Okay. Yes. It is Texas. You need to be wearing a mask. There's some right there at the door. Okay. Who else? Does anybody know who represents this district? Tom Cole. Only the House is directly elected. They're less radical. They wanted indirect consent, filtered through representation. They're going to emphasize stability, order, and slow change. They want things to be slowed down. So when we talk about how government is inefficient, Madison would say, good. Good. It should take some time to make some laws that affect this many people, this big of a nation. The framers are going to value limited government, the rule of law, separation of powers, protection of rights, and majority rule, consent of the governed, democratic accountability. But they're also going to make some compromises. The Great Compromise is going to shape state power. Because the states have a voice, the Senate represents states. Because of that, states have more power than people have power. Okay? Certainly in the Senate, but also in some other places. So that's one place where they get to put a foot on the scales. The compromise over slavery is going to shape attitudes about race until when? Now. It continues to have an impact because of the compromise regarding slavery. They had an opportunity to say, you know, the whole thing about everybody's created equal, let's get rid of slavery. They didn't feel like they could do it because they didn't think they'd get the votes and they wanted the southern states. But they could have. It's a compromise they made. And compromises, you know, when we talk about Congress later, and I actually was just talking about this the other day in class at Jared's in. So, people do not like to see sausage get made. We don't like to watch compromise, right? We say we want compromise, we want them to negotiate and compromise, but we don't want to watch it, and it's something that gets used against people. There's also a compromise regarding the executive. With the Electoral College, it's another place where states put their foot on the scale. They win. States determine who the president is, not people. You say, no, I vote for the president. No, you vote for some electors from your state. That's who you vote for. And then, because the executive is basically written by Alexander Hamilton, who believes George Washington will be this amazing president/king, the powers are unclear. They're vague. Again, we are very fortunate as a nation that George Washington was a little d Democrat. And he stepped down. He said, I am not a king. I'm a president. It's time for somebody else. Political equality and the right to vote, they don't even talk about it. They leave it to the states. It's up to the states to determine who gets to vote, who doesn't get to vote. We talked about the Federalist and Anti-Federalist debates. National power versus state power. Large and diverse nation necessary to preserve rights versus extended government will lead to end of liberty and self-government. In what ways do we continue to argue about these ideas? In what ways do states clash with the national government over power? Who protects liberty? State governments or national governments? Who protects your civil liberties? Who has, over the last 50 years, protected civil liberties? Yeah.
The courts.
What?
The courts.
The what courts? State courts? Federal courts, right? It's the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the 14th Amendment, which we'll talk about. There's really protected rights. States have trampled all over them. States have trampled all over them. Who should have the power to determine, you know, you guys are wearing masks today. Some of you are unhappy about it. Some of you are okay with it. Whatever. But there was a question at the beginning of this pandemic. Should there be a national plan to deal with this? And there wasn't. Right? States piecemeal dealt with it. Sometimes cities dealt with it. And in the wake of that, when cities dealt with it and states didn't like the way they dealt with it, they passed laws saying cities couldn't do things. Who should have the power to respond to a national crisis?
The national government.
This is your opinion, right? I'm asking you. What do you think? I mean, should it be at the very local level? School boards, city government? Should it be at the state level? Should it be at the federal level? Should there be a comprehensive plan? Think about that. I mean, this is a concrete example that you're living through right now. And in part, we're continuing to live through it, and it's worse this year than last year because of these decisions. Okay, I have a different voice for you guys, and we're going to hope that this just opens up, but I'm not entirely sure. So I think I'm going to have to escape.
I'm in Washington, standing in front of the Supreme Court building.
Hold on one second. This is Professor Thomas Patterson. He focuses on American government. He's a professor at Harvard. We're going to watch a couple of things from him over the course of the semester. In addition to that, you're also going to hear lectures from your fellows. Okay? I want you to hear different voices than just my voice.
Where in 2004, 2006, and 2008, the Supreme Court declared that the Bush administration had acted outside the law and hadn't stopped. At issue were policies that Bush had put in place after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Bush had concluded that the United States was engaged in a new kind of war that required a different set of rules. Captured enemy combatants, instead of being tried in regularly constituted courts, would be tried in secret military tribunals. Those that were thought to have important information would be subject to harsh interrogation, including waterboarding, which the United States had condemned as torture when used on American soldiers in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. In one case, the Supreme Court said that the Bush administration had violated the Constitution. In another case, the Supreme Court said that it had violated the laws of Congress and the Geneva Convention. In its final decision, the Supreme Court rejected the Bush administration's claim that the president alone had authority to decide the rules of law during time of war. That judgment, said the court, belongs to us, the court, not to the president. The Supreme Court in those decisions was acting as the framers of the Constitution would have preferred. In the words of John Adams, the nation's second president, the Constitution was designed to create a government of laws rather than of men. A century after the U.S. Constitution was written, William Gladstone, the four-time Prime Minister of Britain, declared it to be the most wonderful work ever struck off by the brain and purpose of man. Gladstone admired the Constitution for the precedent it set. The nation's highest authority would be the words of a document, rather than the dictates of a top ruler. Today we take that idea for granted, but in 1787, when the Constitution was written, it was a revolutionary idea. Elsewhere in the world, the law was what the king said it was. His word was law. America would be governed instead by a constitution that put limits on what those in power could do. In this session, we'll look at why the framers of the Constitution were determined to limit the power of government. Then we'll look at how they built the concept of limited government into the Constitution. Finally, we'll examine whether the Constitution has actually served as an effective check on government. The American Revolution was fought to overthrow what the Declaration of Independence called the absolute tyranny.
You have 1 minute left on attendance.
The framers worried that the U.S. government might itself become tyrannical. It is said that Benjamin Franklin, asked by a woman what type of government the Constitution had created, replied, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." How do you prevent government from becoming tyrannical? You might think it's a constitution that strips government of nearly all power. Some Americans today think that way. A U.S. Senate candidate recently ran on a platform that claimed the government which governs best is the government that governs least. The writers of the Constitution knew that, a lesson they had learned the hard way. When the American states declared their independence from Britain, they wrote a constitution called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles established a national government but gave it almost no authority. It had no power to tax, but instead had to petition the states for money. The states were slow to pay and often paid less than their promised share. During one 5-year period, Georgia and North Carolina paid nothing, not a single dime, to the national treasury. So think about your own finances. What do you do when you're short of cash? Well, for starters, you probably cut back on your spending. You get really desperate, you might try to sell your valuables. Well, that's exactly what the government of the Articles did. To save money, it slashed the army to less than 1,000 men. To raise money, it sold the Navy ships. This at a time when Britain still had a large army in Canada, and Spain had one in what is now Florida. How would the country defend itself if attacked by Britain or Spain? No wonder that George Washington questioned whether the United States deserved even to be called a nation, and worried that it would descend into chaos, opening the door to a tyrannical leader. Now, the Constitution was meant to fix the defects in the Articles of Confederation, but the writers were also determined that the new government not be so strong as to threaten liberty. So their strategy was to grant the national government necessary power, including the power to tax, while at the same time placing strict limits on its authority. This strategy included denials of power. Officials would be prohibited, for example, from putting someone in prison and throwing away the keys. This was a common practice at the time in Europe. Opponents of the king were locked away for as long as the king wanted, forever in many cases. That practice would be prohibited in the United States. The Constitution gives the accused the right to appear before a judge who will determine whether authorities have enough evidence to warrant detention. The writers also sought to limit government through grants of power. Article 1 of the Constitution, the very first article of the Constitution, gives Congress 17 specific powers, such as the power to tax, the power to raise an army and navy, the power to regulate commerce. These grants give power, but they also deny power. Powers not granted to Congress, those not on the list, are denied. In a period of history when other governments admitted to no limits on their powers, this was a substantial limitation. As originally written, the U.S. Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights, a list of specific individual rights, such as freedom of speech. The framers thought a list was unnecessary, because government had only those powers granted to it, and it had not been granted the power to deny people their rights. Thomas Jefferson was among the many who thought otherwise. Jefferson had included a Bill of Rights in the Virginia Constitution he wrote at the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, and other states have followed his example. Said Jefferson, "A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth." In response to such objections, the first Congress passed a series of amendments that were quickly ratified by the states. These amendments, the first 10 of the Constitution, are called the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is a clear example of limited government. If you were arrested tomorrow and had no money, the judge doesn't have the option of saying, "Tough luck, buddy." The government is required by the Sixth Amendment to provide you a lawyer and to pay. Now, the framers didn't think that words alone, written grants and denials, would be enough to control those in power. They wanted something strong. That something was to divide the government into separate branches and pit them against each other. This was not a new idea. The French theorist Montesquieu had proposed it nearly a half a century earlier. Where there is no separation of powers, he wrote, there can be no liberty. But the framers gave Montesquieu's idea a new twist. Rather than completely separating the branches, as he had proposed, they overlapped them so that each was better positioned to act as a check on the other. So instead of granting all legislative power to Congress, they gave some of it to the president. For example, the power to veto law, and some of it to the court, the power to interpret law. The same with executive power. The president has most of it, but not all of it. For example, Congress controls how much money the president can spend and on what. The president doesn't have the option of taking money allocated for highways and spending it on the military. The same with judicial power. For example, by giving the president the power to nominate federal judges and the Senate the power to confirm them. This system of divided power was described by Harvard's Richard Newstead as one of separated institutions sharing power. The powers of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, are granted to separate branches, but no branch has all power within its sphere of authority. Part of it, in every case, is shared with the other two branches, providing them a means of checking that branch's power. So that's the theory, each branch acting as a check on the others. Now, as you know, theory and reality aren't always the same thing. The English poet John Wilmot quipped, "Before I got married, I had 6 theories about raising children. Now I have 6 children and no theory." What about the framers' theory? Well, the record is far from perfect. After Japan attacked U.S. forces at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered the forced relocation of more than 100,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast, saying they might try to help the enemy. They were forced to sell their homes at rock bottom prices and were shipped to detention camps in Utah and other inland states. They lived out the war behind barbed wire, watched over by armed guards. Their advocates looked to Congress for help. Instead, Congress embraced Roosevelt's policy. Not a single senator or House member voted to rescind it. 3 times, the Supreme Court reviewed the policy. Each time, it upheld it, though it was clearly unconstitutional. Racism played into the relocation policy. America had a long history of discriminating against Asians. Chinese were blocked from entry in 1883. Japanese immigration was effectively blocked in 1907. When the survivors of the Titanic arrived by rescue ship in New York Harbor in 1912, they were taken ashore, except for a handful of Chinese crewmen. They were not allowed to set foot on American soil. Ironically, Japanese Americans were allowed during World War II to volunteer for combat in Europe. They made up the entirety of the U.S. Army's 442nd Regiment. That regiment became the most decorated combat unit of its size, not only in World War II, but in the whole of U.S. military history. 21 of its soldiers received the Congressional Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award. In 1988, the United States issued a formal apology for its mistreatment of Japanese Americans, saying it was the result of race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. As the relocation policy indicates, America is not a stranger to tyranny, the powerful trampling on the rights of the weak. Such episodes, however, are relatively few in number, and the system of checks and balances is a reason. Scores of times, the President, Congress, or the Supreme Court has intervened when another branch has overstepped its constitutional authority. The Watergate Scandal is a textbook example. On a June night in 1972, a security guard at the Watergate buildings in Washington, D.C. noticed that the latch on the door to the Democratic Party's national headquarters had been taped over. He removed the tape and went away. Coming back later, he noticed the door had been taped open again. He called police. They caught 5 men inside, installing bugs in the phones and ceilings. As it turned out, they had linked to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. Nixon denied that anyone at the White House had knowledge of the break-in. In truth, the Watergate break-in was part of a much larger dirty tricks campaign aimed at guaranteeing Nixon's re-election. The dirty tricks included wiretaps, tax audits, burglaries of Nixon opponents, paid in part with money laundered illegally through Mexico. A turning point occurred when, during a Senate investigative hearing, a White House assistant revealed that Nixon had tape recorded all of his Oval Office conversations. Nixon at first refused Congress's demand to hear the tape. As the pressure mounted, he released transcripts of what he claimed were all the relevant ones. When Congress demanded more tape material, Nixon refused. Congress then filed suit to get the tapes. In a unanimous decision, the U.S. Supreme Court, which included 4 Nixon appointees, ordered Nixon to turn over the tapes. They were incriminating. Nixon was heard telling his assistants to cover up the Watergate break-in, including using the CIA to block the FBI from investigating it. With that, the House of Representatives began impeachment hearings. At that point, Nixon resigned, the first and only president to do so. President Nixon, despite holding what is often called the most powerful office on earth, was powerless to stop Congress and the Supreme Court from acting. The writers of the Constitution had established them as separate and independent branches of government, and they acted in precisely that way. Now, as I'm sure you recognize, America's system of checks and balances doesn't always operate that decisively. Politics is a rough and sometimes deceitful game. What if the Watergate burglars had not been so stupid as to get caught? Would Nixon's illegal action have been discovered in time to do anything meaningful about it? Presidential secrecy is one of the major threats to the effectiveness of America's system of checks and balances. Congressional secrecy is not a problem. Congress has 535 members, and it couldn't keep a secret if it tried. The presidency is different. Presidents have the loyalty of their assistants and can sometimes withhold potentially damaging information, as occurred during the impeachment of President Donald Trump. During the inquiry, Trump refused to let White House officials testify at House hearings and blocked them from turning over documents to House investigators. Now, a different type of threat to limited government is illustrated by the federal government's detention of Japanese Americans during World War II. In that case, all 3 branches thought a breach of the Constitution served the nation's interests in time of war. There's another threat that has shown itself to be important. It can be seen in the situation we discussed earlier, the Bush administration's anti-terrorism policy. As mentioned, the September 11 terrorist attacks convinced the Bush administration that the war on terrorism required a new set of rules. The rules for handling enemy captives were hatched in secrecy to keep them from scrutiny by Congress. They were also kept secret from those in the administration, including the Secretary of State and former Army General Colin Powell, who would have objected. Slowly, information about the policies leaked out, in some instances through news stories, in other instances through legal cases being argued in federal court. As the information came out, there were calls for congressional hearings, but almost none were held. Even the Supreme Court rulings in 2004 and 2006 against Bush administration policies did not prompt Congress to launch high-profile hearings. Then, in 2007, the number of congressional hearings increased dramatically. Why was that? Why was Congress initially slow to scrutinize Bush policies, but then suddenly eager to do so? As you might have guessed, the answer is partisanship. Through 2006, Republicans controlled the House and the Senate, and thereby controlled the scheduling of hearings. They were not at all interested in holding the Republican administration to account for its policy, knowing that it would hurt their party. Things changed abruptly after Democrats swept the 2006 congressional election and took control of the House and Senate in early 2007. Democrats now controlled the hearing process, and they called one hearing after another. Seeking partisan advantage, they were keen to grill the Bush administration on its war policy. That situation arose again in 2019. During the previous 2 years, when Republicans controlled the House of Representatives, Russia's effort to tip the 2016 presidential election in Donald Trump's favor was the subject of relatively few hearings, and the issue of the Trump campaign's contacts with the Russians was the subject of even fewer. But when Democrats took control of the House in 2019, the number of hearings multiplied, and the inquiries probed more deeply, including whether the president had unlawfully tried to obstruct the Russia investigation. Okay, let's wrap up what we've said in this session. As we noted, the Constitution was designed in part to provide for limited government, meaning a government not so powerful as to threaten liberty. The Constitution contains various controls on government, including grants of power and denials of power. However, the key mechanism is the separation of powers between the three branches: the executive, the legislature, and the judicial. The powers of the branches are overlapped so that each branch can more effectively act as a check on the others. The system doesn't always work as intended. It weakens when, as in the World War II relocation policy, the three branches are united in thinking that the national interest is served by ignoring the Constitution. It weakens when a president succeeds, even for a time, to keep unlawful actions secret. And it weakens when the presidency and Congress are controlled by the same party. Then the majority party, Congress, might seek to play down the issue. Although the U.S. system is not a perfect check on power, the record also shows that on many occasions, dozens of them, it has helped to rein in abuses of power. We'll never know, of course, how U.S. history would have differed if the Constitution had not been based on a system of checks and balances. But the fact that some leaders have tried to operate outside the law suggests they would have done so more readily and more outrageously if the other branches had been powerless to check their actions. There was a great deal of wisdom in what John Adams said in a letter to Thomas Jefferson. I say that power must never be trusted without a check.
So, that's Thomas Patterson, like I said, a professor from Harvard. I have a poll question for you. Which limit on government is most important, do you believe? So, I have sent that poll out. Remember, you're going to go over to the tab that says polls. That's how you do it. There were 206 of you, I think, that were able to log in for attendance, and I think that's pretty much everybody. Looking at the spaces, it's probably pretty close to that. If you weren't able, though, grab me or Eric or anyone, and we can edit attendance. If for some reason you weren't able to log in during attendance, grab Eric or me and we can edit that. Alright, so the poll is still going. It's got another minute and 16 seconds left. I want to remind you guys of important things. On Friday, there's going to be a zombie apocalypse, so be prepared for that. Alright, so read the Constitution before you go. Okay? Secondly, your workbook chapter 2 and 3 are due. Again, it's asking you what you think. You're not having to do outside reading, you're just wanting to think, right?